Alex Katlan is a former board member of Salmagundi and former chair of the Smith Library. He was the first historian of the Salmagundi Club, appointed by Salmagundi Chair Pamela Singleton. He has published 5 books on the club's exhibition histories. In 2008, he was the recipient of the Salmagundi Club Medal of Honor and Merit. He's a highly regarded painting conservator whose clients include museums around the country and the Salmagundi Club. Big round of applause for Alexander.
All coming tonight and helping the library, and the head of the library committee, Jay Barksdale, is here in the audience. Jay, if you would stand up and say welcome. I would also say that I believe, Jay, that the library is open and that anyone can see the library tonight even if they're not a member. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yes. So after the talk, you're more than welcome to go upstairs to view the library and to see some of the beautiful books in the collection. I would like to thank you, and I thought I would start basically with an icon of the club. This is a painting by William Lowe, young artist's life in New York, published by Scribner's in 1880. It was written by William H. Bishop. What's interesting about this is the club in the very early days when it was formed as the Salmagundi Sketch Club in 1871 would move from artist studio to artist studio. And if you look here, this is the skylight studio of Jonathan Scott Hartley, who was an early member. His brother, Joseph Hartley, was the first president of the club. And over here in the corner, I don't know where over there is William Lowe, who created this painting. And the fisticuffs is one of the pugilists is J. Francis Murphy, who was an American tonalist. Jonathan Scott Hartley is making the very famous Salmagundi stew that is still served in the dining room and is actually on the menu tonight, so you're more than welcome to try it. And in the back you see the artists critiquing the sketches that they did. They would meet every couple of weeks, and there would be a theme of you know, different themes that they would give out for the members to do. In the early days, there was about 28 members of the club. This is Fire by George Innes Jr. This is George Innes' son, who was a member of the club. George Innes Sr. was never a member. And you can see that these subjects, you know, for the various drawings were, and these are just a few that are mentioned. William Jobson recently sent out an email to the membership that mentioned some of these, and some other of these themes were also published in William H. Shelton's, the first librarian of the club and the historian of the club, who wrote the history of the Salmagundi Club, published in 1917. And I'll be reading a few pages of that. Here is William Hitchcock Lowe. I would like to thank William Roca for bringing these photos of Lowe in his studio in Bronxville, and also the Albany Institute of Art. And okay. This is a self-portrait by Lowe, and a painting by him. And the next slide. I don't know why this is on.
Your angle's not good. No, okay. Flip. Is it not catching?
It's not there.
You're gonna have. All right, looks like I'm doing this.
Okay. This slide I put in, this is from the library, some of the ephemera of the library. And the club would have these dinners, this is much later, and they would get together in the fall, and these were called get-together dinners, where they would be coming back from the artist colonies or the art schools that they had gone and left in the summer, and in the spring they would leave New York, going back to these colonies to create the art that they were bringing back in the fall to sell at the club or in New York at that time. Next slide, please. And here is some of the decorations from these dinners. And unfortunately, we only have photographs of those decorations because they were only done on newsprint or very poor quality paper, and none of them have really survived in the collection. Next slide, please. These paintings I brought down, the Hildebrandt, Howard Hildebrandt, the Young Bathers, and also the Charles Hawthorne. Charles Hawthorne was the founder of the Cape Cod School of Art, which later became the Provincetown Art Colony. And here is a painting that he did in Griside of the gentleman at the dining room table. This one. And this is the Hildebrandt. And I will tell you, years ago, I've been a member of the club since '82, and years ago there was an elderly lady that came in to the club, and this was hanging, the Hildebrandt painting, this one, was hanging in the parlor of the Young Bathers, and she said, "You see that little girl there with her backside there?" She says, "That's me when I was young." So it was great to meet her. Now, Howard Hildebrandt was president of the Salmagundi School, but he did not found it. It was founded by Solon Borglum, who was the brother of the Borglum that did Mount Rushmore. And he was a member of the club. Another art colony that the club was very active with was the Old Lyme Art Colony that was founded at the Florence Griswold House. It was founded by Henry Ward Granger, who was a member in 1887. He had studied at the Barbizon School in France and was basically a tonalist, and the landscapes that he did up in Lyme were very tonalistic, but very shortly after he founded this, the Griswold School, he moved on, and Child Hassam, the American Impressionist and also a member of the club, became the head of Lyme. Alpheus Cole was one of the oldest living members of the club. We have a number of works in the collection, and here is an example of Cole's painting here that we rarely exhibit. And Carlton Wiggins, the whole Wiggins clan, the Wiggins family, were part of the club. Carlton Wiggins was the grandfather, and then there was Guy A. and Guy C. Wiggins that were members here. And Dorothy Wiggins is still an active member and on the board of trustees. Next slide. And here is a bit of information about the Lyme Academy, the Lyme Art Colony. It was only formed in 1899. Remember, the club was formed in 1871, so we actually pre-exist the Lyme Academy. The the Lime Art Colony. I keep on wanting to call it Academy. This is a statement, and this is the Griswold House up in Lyme. Next slide, please. And similarly, Henry Holbrook Nichols, who was the president of the club, he would go to Connecticut, the Kent Colony, and Bronxville Art Colony, and Charles Groupie, who did work, and again, there were 3 generations of the Groupie family that were members of the club. Next slide, please. And so I'm jumping back to Jonathan Scott Hartley because his studio was in the old university building on Washington Square. Next slide, please. And this is a Buman photo. He was married to Helen Innes, and Helen Innes was the daughter of George Innes, the famous American landscape painter. George Innes was never a member, and his palette is hanging in the hallway here because it is the tonalist or the Innes influence that is so predominant in the early years of the club. And I wanted to just read you a statement by him from George Innes, which he said, "The true use of art is, first, to cultivate the artist's own spiritual nature." So American tonalism was about American spiritualism. It was replacing the Hudson River School of Art. And this is before American Impressionism really took hold. The names that are in bold type are people that are members of the club, and the SC 1878, right after it, is when J. Francis Murphy joined the club. And his palette is there because he was such a famous tonalist artist. Murphy, here is a Grisaille painting from one of the black and white exhibitions called A Bit of Lowland, that's in the club's collection. And Murphy lived in had a studio in this opera house where he actually did landscape scenery for that in Remsen Street. Next slide, please. And here is the Edwin Lord Weeks. The painting is right over there. Another Grisaille painting, The Gate of the Mosque at Bazar Khan. And it's really quite a lovely painting. Weeks is also in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Next slide, please. And here we have Hugh Bolton Jones, a typical tonalist painting. He was known for his landscapes and so on. Next slide, please. And here is the old university building where Jonathan Scott Hartley had his studio. But it is also in this building that we see that there is other artists from the club that had studios in the building. And I would like to read you from Shelton's history a little of the first location where the club used to meet. And he says, and this is from his publication of 1917, "In the fall of 1881, the club rented a portion of the large studio of Robert Minor in the old university building on Washington Square. The first meeting of the season was held in the chapel of the university. The new room was not yet ready. The Minor studio was originally a hall or a classroom of huge proportions, so that when one end was screened off for the club, an exceptionally large studio remained. The walls were covered with gray burlap, and under the high ceiling, together with the other generous dimensions of the room, there was a new feeling of space and freedom and importance." So this was one of the first rentals that the club actually did in 1881. And next slide, please. And here is a portrait of Robert Minor and a photo of him in the studio at university, at the university building, which was demolished by NYU at a later date. And here is examples of Robert Minor's work. And you can see it's very atmospheric, very tonalist work, and you can see the etching of the windmill on the other side. Next slide, please. And here is Minor after he moves in 1900 to the Sherwood building, which we're going to talk a little bit further about. Next slide, please. And here is the Sherwood building, built in 1879 at 58 West 57th Street, so it's a little further uptown. It was demolished in 1960, and there were many artists in the studio from the club. It was a studio building. And next slide, please. And here is a costume party of 1889, and the names in bold type are members of the club. Note that William Metcalf and Robert Reed were not members of the club. Robert Reed was a member of the Lambs Club. William Metcalf was an American Impressionist. But Sam Isham, Harry Watrous, and Colton Chapman were early members of the club. Next slide, please. And here is John Gulf, who had a studio in the Sherwood building. He was an animal artist, an animal painter, and this is a carte de visite that is actually in the club's collection. Next slide, please. And here is an example of his work, the cat and the book. This does not belong to the club, but the palette of the cat is in the club's collection, and it used to be on exhibition. Next slide, please. And James Carroll Beckwith was also in the Sherwood building, and his painting is right behind me of this young girl in profile, and he was known for these wonderful paintings of these young women. Next slide, please. And here is Francis C. Jones, again, a member from 1888, and his studio, again, a carte de visite that's in the club's collection. Next slide. And years ago, on the second floor, this no longer exists, these carte de visites were mounted in these frames, these long, thin frames. This is called Blenner, another member, and many of these photographs I took when they were in those frames. Unfortunately, the curators committee decided to deframe all of these long frames, and the carte de visites are in the collection, but you rarely see them now because they have no way of exhibiting them except in cases. Next slide. And William Howe was another member, but he was also a member of the Lyme Art Colony, and this is a photo from the panel over the fireplace. Next slide, please. And here is the Florence Griswold house, and you can see over the fireplace here this series of paintings of the members in the colony up at the Florence Griswold house. And you can see all the names of the people that were members there. William Robinson, William Howe Foote, Henry Ward Granger, Henry C. White, Bicknell, Hassam, Wiggins, and so on. Next slide, please. And here is Howe's studio in Paris. Next slide, please. And here is the Benedict building, which was a local building. It was originally called the Tuckerman Building and was built by McKim, Mead, and Bigelow. This is before Stanford White joined the McKim, Mead, and White architectural firms. Stanford White was the first architectural member of the Salmagundi Club. What's important about this is the artist Frank M. Gregory, not just St. Gordon's or George Maynard or John Lafarge. By the way, the library has a couple of books from the Lafarge Library that was donated by his wife after John Lafarge dies in 1910. But I wanted to talk about Frank Gregory because this is the second location where they move to. Next slide, please.
Is that building still there?
No, the building was demolished. So Shelton says the fourth exhibition in 1882, he's talking about the black and white exhibitions, which were conducted while the club was still on its migrations. By that he meant that they're moving from artist studio to artist studio to have their meeting, was the first financial success and actually leaving a balance on the right side of the ledger of $253.60. With this encouragement, the club gave up its wanderings. And in the fall of 1884, the meetings began in the studio of the secretary, Frank M. Gregory, in the Benedict on Washington Square, which continued to be the headquarters of the club until the annual black and white exhibitions came to an end in 1887. Frank Gregory was known for his etchings of New York scenes, such as this one. Next slide, please. And here he is, and this is an etching of Trinity Church that's in the club's collection that I donated, actually. Next slide, please. And here is an invitation they used to do for the membership, because there weren't that many members, back 28 members at that time. They would do handwritten invitations with drawings and images. And here is an invitation by Frank Gregory, and you can see it's signed. Over here, Gregory. But here that they're meeting at Cerrone's photographic studio, which is on Union Square. Next slide. This is from a private collection, this invitation. Next slide. And this is an invitation by Cerrone. The image of the young girl was painted by Napoleon Cerrone. And this is inviting you in 1880 to a meeting of the Salmagundi Sketch Club at the studio there. Next slide, please. And here we have Napoleon Cerrone. The photo on the albumin photo on the left, he's obviously had a haircut and his goatee has been trimmed. But he's next slide. He's wearing his Astrokian hat, and this is how he usually looked. He cultivated. He was a photographer. He did. He also was had an etching firm, but he also cultivated the persona of an artist. He was a member of the Tile Club, the Salmagundi Sketch Club, the Palette Club, and the Sketch Club, which was another organization in the village here. Next slide. And here we have a photograph of Cerrone's photographic studio at 37 Union Square. This is the studio. You can see the crocodile. You can see the John Rogers sculptural group in the background on the left. This is the right photograph is in the club's collection. You can see in that photograph the Chinese bell. And here we have, in 1894, Union Square, and you can see Cerrone's building right in the center there, next to the Decker building, I believe it is. And if you look carefully, you can see Bertano's is right there on Union Square. So my question is, what other buildings were in this area that created the environment for the club to be founded here. And next slide, and you will see here is Britanno's. Before they moved up, it was called Britanno's Literary Emporium. Next slide. And here we have the founding of the Art Students League, which many of the members of the club both participated as students but also as instructors. That was founded in 1875 at 5th Avenue and 16th Street. Those were rented spaces, which they outgrew very rapidly and moved to 1882 to 38 West 14th Street, which was right off Union Square. And the building here is the building that they moved to in 1892, where the Art Students League is still at 215 West 57th Street. And it was founded by a group of art students that hoped to escape the National Academy, which had become so staid or conservative in their approach. And these young artists wanted to have more freedom in terms of the kind of artwork that they were exhibiting, and also whether or not they could work from the live model and so on. Many of the instructors at the Art Students League were also members of the Salmagundi Club at that time, like Frank Dumond and so on. Next slide, please. Yeah, I wanted to show you that in this area at 359 Broadway in 1850, Matthew Brady, the famous photographer, opened up his studio and established a daguerreotype salon, the first in New York, and the Village Preservation was very active in preserving this building, which is still there and preserved by their efforts. Next photo. And it was there, though the owners of the building contested it, that Abraham Lincoln, when he came to give his speech at Cooper Union, was photographed in 1860. And it was at Cooper Union, the foundation building, that was in this area and included many women artists. You can see the foundation building on the right as it is today, and you can see what it looked like in the past. Next slide, please. And what else was in this area was the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which was in the Douglas Mansion, and Francis D. Millett was one of the trustees, who was also a member of the Salmagundi Club, an active member. And this is a painting that he did that's in the collection of the Met. Okay, let me just want to read something. Also in this area, and this was recently published by Village Preservation, they had on their website a map of Lower Fifth Avenue, and the founder of the Metropolitan Museum of Art at 8 Fifth Avenue was John Taylor Johnson, who lived within the area. Next slide, please. And also the National Academy of Design, which was at 23rd and Park, and of course the Century Club, which became the Century Association, was originally here at 109 East 15th Street. So you can see that there's a whole very strong artist community in the area. The black and white exhibitions ended up at the National Academy of Design in the 1880s and so on. Next slide, please. And now I'm jumping back to Cerrone because I want to touch on this, why Cerrone as a photographer is so important, not so much as an artist, even though he was a member of the Tile Club. It is because Cerrone would photograph theater and celebrity people. When Oscar Wilde came to New York, he did a series of photographs and would copyright them and sign the copyright form. And so when the photograph, it's not this photograph that was taken by Borough Lithograph and used commercially, he brought a lawsuit against Borough Lithograph, which went all the way to the Supreme Court in 1884. And Cerrone claimed that the photographic method was a creative process, that it was not a mechanical process, and Borough Lithograph was claiming that it was simply a mechanical process and therefore could not be copyrighted. This was not agreed to, next slide please, by the U.S. Supreme Court that ruled against Borough Lithograph about 6 years before this photograph was taken by Cerrone at his studio on Union Square. And it is that ruling that established that photography was a creative process and is why photography is in museums all across this country and why photography is exhibited in this club. Next slide, please. Now here are the black and white exhibitions. These were very important exhibitions, and I wanted you to imagine that in 1878, when the club started, there were only a few artists, and they decided to hold an international exhibition. And imagine if that was today, 28 artists having a little organization, inviting international artists to participate. Do you think it would occur? Of course not. But in 1878, it did occur. And not only did it occur, but it attracted major artists, both internationally and nationally, including women artists of the time. And I want to read you some of these artists if I can find the page. Oh, no, that's not it. Here it is. So, next slide. So the first meetings of this was in Levitt's Gallery Art Rooms in 1878. Lesser known, even today, women artists were prominently displayed, such as Agnes Abbott, Alice Barber Stevens, Fidelia Bridges, Mary Nemo Moran, and Maria Dewing, and they hung alongside renowned American artists like Edwin Austin Abbey, who was a member, William Merritt Chase, who was a member, Kenyon Cox, who was not, Jasper Croftsy, who was not a member of the club, Winslow Homer, who was not, the Morans, Edward Leon Percy, and Peter and Thomas, Henry Ward Ranger, John Singer Sargent, Walter Sherlock, Theodore Robinson, and James McNeill Whistler. Imagine Whistler and Sargent exhibiting, and Homer exhibiting in these little exhibitions. Next slide. Shortly after that, in 1879, they moved to Kurtz's Art Gallery. This is the Kurtz building, and he was in the Civil War, and he was a fairly prominent art gallery. Next slide, please. And then eventually to the National Academy of Design. Next slide, please. And here, and then also to the galleries of the American artists. Association in the building. The National Academy of Design, you can see, was influenced by the Doge's palaces in Venice and was an imitation of those palaces. Next slide, please. And here is Varnishing Day in the National Academy and Exhibition Day in the Academy, and you can see it follows the atelier tradition coming from Paris. Next slide. And what is important about, one of the things that is very important, was that William Merritt Chase exhibited in 1880 the first monotypes that were ever exhibited in New York or the States, and they were called impressions from a copper plate. By 1882, Chase was calling them monotypes, and it was the first usage of the term monotype in New York. And there was actually a corridor of monotypes at the National Academy. Next slide, please. And here, Chase continues working in monotypes. This is Alice Gearson, his wife, who posed for this. It's a monotype called Reverie. It's in the Metropolitan Museum of Art collection and was published by Century Magazine. Next slide, please. And here is the Sargent painting that was exhibited in the 1884 black and white exhibitions, and it's called Fume d'Amberies. And I'm not sure whether it's this painting or a grisaille painting of this painting that was exhibited, but you can see how monochromatic this painting is, how dramatic the painting, this Sargent, is, and why it really complements the black and white exhibitions, which are exhibitions. They did allow a little bit of umber and so on in some of the monotype paintings. So I'm not sure whether this is the painting or whether there was a study that was exhibited. Next slide. And here is the artist a little later. You can see they're a little wealthier, and of the meeting of the Salmagundi Club published by H.P. Scher. Next slide, please. And finally, the club moves to John Rogers' studio. John Rogers was a sculptor of Victorian groups. Weighing the Baby is an example of him. He was never a member, even though we have some of his work in the collection here. In 1878, he purchases a studio, a space up in New Canaan, Connecticut. By 1893, his health is seriously diminished, and by then also the Victorian groups were losing popularity. He moves to New Canaan, and it becomes the first, his space, his studio, 12 West 14th Street, next slide please, becomes the first clubhouse of the club, 14 West 12th Street, excuse me. And that building is now part of the rectory of the church. These are drawings by Charles S. Chapman, who was a member of the club, and these drawings. This is the outside of the building, and there's the exhibition area. And it was this clubhouse, next slide please, that allowed, and here is Chapman leaning against the fireplace. Next slide please. And here is the entranceway to this clubhouse at 14 West 12. And notice that the panel paintings that are on the right side above the Innes palette is hanging there. That's one of the first palettes. And it is because of this clubhouse that the club was able to start the collection of art that they held. It was also because of that they started the palette collection and also the library collection, and also started creating the painted mugs that you have there. And notice that these tiles This fireplace done in Delft blue were done by the members of the club, but many of them were also members of the Tile Club. Next slide, please. And here is again the dining room of that location. And if you look carefully on the left side, you'll see a chair there, a double arm chair. That chair is still in the library today. You can go upstairs and see it. So, and many of these mugs are still in the club's collection. But these are not the library mugs. Next slide. These are the library mugs that were created to raise funds for the library. In the club moved into this building in about 1894. By 1899, 98, 99, they realized that they suddenly had to raise money to take care of the library because it wasn't just collecting books. You had to take care of the books. So they came up with this novel idea of having 24 artists paint mugs, drinking mugs, in Delft blue, and they would sell them at the library dinner. And these are the library mugs. And I would say over 800 of them were, this practice continued all the way up to about 1928 and maybe 27, and then was discontinued. So these mugs, some of them were purchased by members and donated back to the club. You can see them in the library, but also you can still find them sometimes at auction, and many of the club members are trying to collect them. Next slide. And here we have the Tile Club and the Salmagundi Club meeting together. William Shelton, the club librarian, is right over here, and this table was probably the Tile Club. And you can see they're painting tiles and so on. The connection between the Tile Club and the Salmagundi Club was a very strong one. And I wanted to read you from Shelton about the Tile Club. Next slide, please. So the Tile Club first met at number 2 Union Square, which is right within the area. And actually that studio, which was a rooftop studio, eventually became the studio with William H. Shelton. That's where his studio was. And then they moved to 58 and a half West 15th Street, and supposedly they dissolved around 1887. Here are some of the members of the club. Those in bold type were members of both the Salmagundi Club and the Tile Club. And each of these artists would have a nickname which they would use on their adventures. They would go out, for example, went out to the Hamptons, and it is how Thomas Moran discovered East Hampton and why his studio is in East Hampton today, still preserved. When the Erie Canal was opened up, they had a barge, and they went up the Erie Canal with a butler, and these adventures were written up in Scribner's magazine and became a sensation. And here you have a little drawing of the Tile Club members there. But let me read you what he says. The Tile Club was never intended, like the Century Club or the Salmagundi Club, to develop into a permanent organization. Indeed, if such a development had resulted, it would have been a living offense to the spirit of its founders. The Tile Club was born in maturity. It was limited in membership carefully to forestall expansion. It was exclusive and perfectly satisfied with its 22 members and 3 musicians. It was organized at number 2 Union Square in an attic studio, afterwards occupied by the writer of this history, all of which is fully described by the Owl. The Owl is the nickname for F. Hopkinson Smith, who was an artist and also wrote a number of books that are in the library, and also a member of the club. And in his book, Woodfire, in number 3, talks about the Tile Club. Madame Blavatsky flew away to India with one of its original members. 1 or 2 were eliminated, but nobody ever resigned. For although its habitat was New York, the organization was international. It had no non-resident members, no dues, no forms, no officers. It never met officially or ever adjourned. It ceased to be when its members were too widely scattered to congregate socially. It went out like a candle, snuffed by the wind, when there was no one at hand to relight it. And in its demise, it did honor to the purpose of its founders. The club is very fortunate that the Tile Club members were also members here. We have an original Tile Club book, which is signed by all these members. It's unique. Even the Met doesn't have a book like this, even though they have a copy of it. They do not have the signed copy. Next slide, please. And in 1904, the club has a Tile Club dinner. So I propose that even though the art historians say that it disappeared in 1887, I propose that they continued in an informal format at the club. And partly because George Maynard, the bird of freedom there, became the 2nd president of the Salmagundi Club. And I think when that occurred in the 1888, that the Tile Club just continued in another format. And also, the Tile Club did not have a ceramicist, did not have a potter. And it was the club's potter, Charles Boatmore, that was the potter for the Tile Club. Next slide, please. And here is one of the tiles that was created on the left side. Supposedly both Edwin Austin Abbey and Frederick Dialman, Abbey probably did the head and Dialman did the background. And on the right side is one of their excursions to Greenport, Long Island, which was there was no railroads or anything. They had to go by boat or ferry up there. And the same was true of their excursion to East Hampton. Next slide, which you'll see here. Here's Edwin Austin Abbey. This is a detail of one of the watercolors. Now, the Abbey estate is up at Yale. And right now there is an American Renaissance show at the Yale University Art Gallery. And that shows both Abbey's work, but also St. Gordon's and a number of other artists of the American Renaissance. All that, many of them that were members here of the club. Next slide, please. And here we have the Tile Club, an etching done by Charles S. Reinhardt. And guess where they're meeting? Recognize these Cerrone statue? Here is Cerrone's studio. And there is in history that the Tile Club and the Salmagundi Club met in the same room, and there were 2 tables in the large photographic room, and the members would simply walk across the room from one meeting to another when they were meeting. Next slide, please. And here we have George Maynard, who was the 2nd president of the club, Charles Yardley Turner, the 3rd, Thomas Moran, the 4th, and we have on the right-hand side from the black and white exhibitions of 1881, the Fantasia. Now, I want to tell you why these black and white exhibitions were so important. Because they were open to all artists. It was not just the membership of the Salmagundi Club. It was juried by the Salmagundi Club. So women artists were there, European artists were there, and it is because of these exhibitions that Andrea Zorn and Alphonse Mucha and other international artists joined the club because they were aware of these early black and white exhibitions. Next slide, please. And here we have Augustus St. Gordon's, who was an active member of many of these organizations with one of his sculptures. And his influence was pervasive at the club. Next slide, please. And here we have the Medal of Honor done by Ulysses A. Ricci, who was a sculptor of the club that was influenced by St. Gordon's, and also did some of the U.S. Treasury monetary, as well as William Fraser, who was another sculpture member of the club. Next slide. And here we have Philip Martini, who was assistant to St. Gordon's. And here's, on the right is an example of one of his works, Continent of Asia and Europe, and a photograph of him. And next slide, please. And our own Anthony Belov did research on the grotesques in the Salmagundi bar downstairs. And it is a confirmation of what I was told in 1982 when I joined this club. And I was told that it was done by an assistant of St. Gordon's, but I never knew the name. So thank you, Anthony, for finding out that it was Philip Martini, who was a member in 1904, who did these grotesques. Next slide. And it is done in staff, a cementous plaster. It's not marble, and you can see that in the way the work is fabricated. Now, also, Anthony, may I ask you, am I wrong in saying that Martini also on Washington Square Monument did the eagles on the monument of Washington Square?
Yes, that's true.
Is that
Just the eagles.
Just the eagles.
On either side of the arch.
On
Keystone.
And is that in staff or is
No,
that?
that's marble.
That's marble.
Yeah,
Okay.
in stone and in bronze also.
So here we have a member of the club who's not only decorating the club because St. Gordon's by 1917, when they moved into this building, was very elderly. Martini does these grotesques, and he's also doing the eagles on Washington Square Monument. Incredible. Next slide, please. And here is Harry Watros, who helped found, how am I doing on time, buddy?
You're going to have 10 minutes.
Oh, okay. Harry Watros, who was first the secretary and then the director of the National Academy, and helped form the palette collection, which he gave over 80 palettes to the club in 1917 when they bought this building. Next slide, please. And here is Watros. And the famous National Arts Club painting, some little talk of me and thee there was, that's hanging in the dining room of their club, was done by Watros. But Watros was more known for his oriental still lifes, as you see on the left side. Next slide. And now I'd like to talk briefly about the 10th Street Studio building that was designed by William Morris Hunt, unfortunately demolished. but so many artists. Edward Lamson Henry was a very early member. He was not part of the Hudson River School. His estate also is up at Yale, and they have many paintings. But of course, the 10th Street Studio building was known for a number of the Hudson River School artists that were there. Heed, Bierstadt Church, J.G. Brown was an early member, but also, more importantly, a genre painting and a member of this club. And in 1879, Chase moves in Walter Shirlow, who was a very well-known artist and teacher at that time, and Frederick Dialman. Next slide, please. And here we have Chase in the 10th Street Studio building on the right side, and we have Chase meeting Whistler on the left side. And these connections between the artists that were members with other artists that were international, it's a small community. It is why they all participated in these early exhibitions. Next slide, please. And here we have another photo of that studio at 10th Street Studio. And the silhouettes here are of Chase on the left side, Alice Gearson, which became Chase's wife, and then on the right-hand side, on the right of those silhouettes, is Walter Shirlow. And the menu that I showed you from 1904 of the Tile Club, if you notice that in the names that signed that menu, Chase's name was not there. And the reason Chase's name was not there, because he was supposed to be, was he sent a telegram to the club saying, it's a girl. His wife had a little baby girl that day. So, next slide. And here is J.G. Brown at his 10th Street Studio building, and was one of the last of the original studio people to leave in 1900. And next slide will show you an example of his genre style, that street urchins that he did. He became famous for that. This is out of favor now, this style of painting, but in the 19th century this was very popular. Next slide. And here is J.G. Brown's palette in the Salmagundi Club collection. And with a little painting. Most of the palettes do not have paintings on them. There's only a few, and this is an example of one, partly because Harry Watrous, who created his collection of palettes, asked the artist simply to organize the colors in the way they organize their palette, and to sign the palette. So these are basically demonstration palettes. This is more of a working palette, which is why Brown put a portrait there. Next slide. And I'd like to thank you all for your participation and kind attendance, and for supporting this historic institution, and I hope that you will continue to do so.
We have time for questions, so.
A couple of the members, when you would list when they initially joined the Salmagundi Club, it said SCF Cerrone, for example. What was the difference between just the SC and the S?
Even though, when they had their centennial in 1972, was the 100th-year anniversary of the club, and there was a centennial dinner, and they produced a roster of all the members. When Dr. Clark Marlowe, who was an art historian, produced that roster, he only said that the founding members were the members that were in 1871. I actually think that's not quite 100%. I believe that any of these artists that joined in the 1870s were founding members, because it was so early, and the club was sort of amorphous, and the membership was very loose. So I wanted to give these members from the 1870s as a founding member. And I consider Cerrone as one of the founding members.
We had a question way in the back there.
When you showed the artist, one of the early shows, it varnishing dated. What is that? Naive question, but I would maybe. What is
Okay, so in Europe, when they the Paris salons or in London the London salon, the artists would bring in the paintings. You know, there was a deadline, and they would have to have the paintings on at the facility in Paris or London. And because of Turner in London, who never finished his paintings, he was constantly working on his paintings, and because he was such a famous artist, they allowed Turner to sort of on varnishing day, that is when they're putting the final varnish on the painting, actually to retouch some of his paintings, and he ended up repainting the painting. So varnishing day became a big tradition in London, where artists would go in and do the final touch-ups and varnishing, putting a final varnish, a glossy varnish, so that they could see the colors and so on, the intensity. And this was also true in Paris. So varnishing day, when the National Academy did shows, continued here following that tradition.
I became a member in '83, you said you became a member in '82.
Yes.
I know why I became a member, why did you?
Good question. I became a member, and I shouldn't say this, but I don't care. I became a member because I'm a painting conservator, and I would, and I basically was working on 19th century American paintings, even though I had been trained on European paintings in 13th and 14th century panel painting. So when I started working on American paintings, I kept on finding labels that said Salmagundi Thumb Box Exhibition, and they would have the name of the artist, and they would have the title of the painting, but there wouldn't be a date. Or they would be Salmagundi Auction of Paintings. And same thing, no date. And there was a logic to why there was no date on these labels. Because they wanted to reuse the labels every year. So they didn't put a date on the labels because they didn't want to have to reprint the labels. They were cheap. So I called up the club in '82 and asked if they could tell me the date of when this painting was done, which was clearly signed by the artist, and it clearly had a Salmagundi label. And I was told on the phone, should I say this?
I don't know what you're going to say.
I was told on the phone, we are a volunteer organization, and we do not, this is the curator's commission, we have no time to do this research. I'm very sorry. You can come to the club and try to research it yourself. I joined the club.
Smart.
Terrifically informative. One elementary question. Which artist specifically chose the name Salmagundi Club? And were there any other names that went by the wayside that were not selected?
We don't know that. I want you to know that the early history and the documents are very sporadic and sketchy, even in libraries and so on throughout the area or along the East Coast. When I was researching these books, the club's exhibition records were incomplete, and I tried to complete them by finding exhibition catalogs and brochures from other library collections. I found some, but there are still absent years and so on in these exhibitions. And I only did 2 exhibitions, and there were more than 2 exhibitions at the club. I did the annual painting exhibition at the club and the annual auction of paintings at the club. And I only went up to 1951 in my publication. I did the black and white exhibitions because these were public exhibitions in which women artists were exhibited alongside the men. So my question when I was doing that research was, why didn't they allow women artists to continue at the club? And I believe it's this myth, this story that relates to Cooper Union building, where Alice Don Levy her father was a portrait painter, and she was a illustrator and did designs for some of the periodicals. And Alice Don Levy hosted, because her father had died and she was a spinster, she had the early meetings of the club sometimes in her house and would create a stew. And the story is that they named the stew, the Salmagundi stew, for her creation. But she also supposedly wanted to form a women's club at Cooper Union for artists. And I think that's maybe one of the reasons. Now, women artists were accepted early in the club in the 70s, earlier than a lot of the other organizations. The other possibility is that the club was just modeled after the European clubs, the men's club in London, and therefore they kept it as a men's club.
If I could interject, for those of you who don't know, Salmagundi is an old French term which means a mélange or a medley. And the first time it appears in American English is the Salmagundi papers that were printed in the early 19th century by Washington Irving and his cohorts, and they came out only occasionally. But the idea of Salmagundi stew being basically whatever was in the house, she just threw in to the pot, and it's a very plausible reason why the club is named Salmagundi. Yeah.
The idea of the club,
The last, please.
the idea of the club and the artists in the club. So they think of the club, or they think of the association of artists.
I think from the very beginning, it was not just a club of artists, it was a club of non-artists and artists. Joseph Hartley, who was the first president of the club, brother of Jonathan Scott Hartley, that was married to Helen Innes, which is the Innes connection to this club, was not an artist. He was a lay member, which we now call patron member. So from the very beginning, non-artists and artists were members. And because of that, it created a strength of the club where many of the art directors and people from the different magazines, Scribner's, Harper's, Saturday Evening Post, Cosmopolitan, all their directors, art directors, were members here. And by being a member of the Salmagundi Club, they actually got jobs while they were members here. And in fact, Blumenschein, who founded the Taoist School in the West in New Mexico, the reason he went out west was because he got a job from one of the art directors for the railroad to do posters to entice people to travel west. And he traveled west to to New Mexico, fell in love with Taos and created that art colony there. This is why we have such a strong connection with Western artists. So Taos, Rungius, Remington was not a member, but Philip Goodwin was a member. All of these guys from the 1900s were